A certain king and queen had 3 daughters. The charms of the 2 elder were more than common, but the beauty of the youngest was so wonderful that the poverty of language is unable to express its due praise. The fame of her beauty was so great that strangers from neighboring countries came in crowds to enjoy the sight, and looked on her with amazement, paying her that homage which is due only to Venus and herself. In fact, Venus found her altars deserted, while men turned their devotion to this young virgin. As she passed along, the people sang her praises, and strewed her way with chaplets and flowers. This homage to the exaltation of a mortal gave great offense to the real Venus. Shaking her ambrosial locks with indignation, she exclaimed, "Am I then to be eclipsed in my honors by a mortal girl? In vain did that royal shepherd, whose judgment was approved by Jove himself, give me the palm of beauty over my illustrious rivals, Pallas to Juno. But she shall not so quietly usurp my honors. I will give her cause to repent of so lawfully a beauty." Thereupon she calls her winged son Cupid, mischievous enough in his own nature, and rouses and provokes him yet more by her complaints. She points out Psyche to him and says, "My dear son, punish that communious beauty. Give your mother a revenge as so sweet as her injuries are great. Infuse into the bosom of that hardy girl a passion for some low, mean, unworthy being, so that she may reap a mortification as great as her present exaltation and triumph." Cupid prepared to obey the commands of his mother. There are 2 fountains in Venus's garden, one of sweet waters and the other of bitter. Cupid filled 2 amber vases, one from each fountain, and suspending them from the top of his quiver, hastened to the chamber of Psyche, whom he found asleep. He shed a few drops from the bitter fountain of her lips, though the sight of her almost moved him to pity, then touched her side to the point of his arrow. At the touch she awoke, and opened eyes upon Cupid, himself invisible, which so startled him that in his confusion he wounded himself with his own arrow. Heedless of his wound, his whole thought now was to repair the mischief he had done, and he had poured the balmy drops of joy all over her silken ringlets. Psyche, henceforth frowned upon by Venus, derived no benefit from all her charms. True, all eyes were cast eagerly upon her, and every mouth spoke her praises, but neither king royal mouth nor plebeian presented himself to demand her in marriage. Her 2 elder sisters of moderate charms had now long been married to royal princes, but Psyche, in her lonely apartment, deplored her solitude, sick of that beauty which, while it foreseed abundance of flattery, had failed to awaken love. Her parents, afraid that they had unwittingly incurred the anger of the gods, consulted the oracle of Apollo, and received this answer: "The virgin is destined for the bride of no mortal lover. Her future husband awaits her on top of the mountain. He is a monster whom neither gods nor men can resist." This dreadful decree of the oracle filled all the people with dismay, and her parents abandoned themselves to the grief. But Psyche said, "Why, my dear parents, do ye now lament me? You should rather have grieved when the people showered upon me undeserved honors, and with the one voice called me a Venus. I now perceive that I am a victim to that name. I submit. Lead me to that rock to which my unhappy fate has destined me." Accordingly, all things being prepared, the royal maid took her place in the procession, which more resembled a funeral than a nuptial pomp, and with her parents, amid the lamentations of the people, ascended the mountain, on the summit of which they left her alone, and with sorrowful hearts returned home. While Psyche stood on the ridge of the mountain, panting with fear and with eyes full of tears, the gentle zephyr raised her from the earth and bore her with an easy motion into a flowery dale. By degrees her mind became composed, and she laid herself down on the grassy bank to sleep. When she awoke refreshed with sleep, she looked round and beheld near a pleasant grove of tall and stately trees. She entered it, and in the mist discovered a fountain, sending forth clear and crystal waters, and fast by a magnificent palace, whose august front impressed the spectre that it was not the work of a mortal hands, but the happy retreat of some god. Drawn by admiration and wonder, she approached the building and ventured to enter. Every object she met filled her with pleasure and amazement. Golden pillars supported the vaulted roof, and the walls were enriched with carvings and paintings representing beasts of the chase and royal scenes. Adapted to the light of the eye of the beholder, proceeding onward, she perceived that besides the apartments of the state, there were others filled with all manner of treasures, and beautiful and precious productions of nature and art. While her eyes were thus occupied, a voice addressed her, though she saw no one, uttering these words, "Sovereign lady, all that you see is yours. We whose voices you hear are your servants and shall obey all your commands with our utmost care and diligence. Retire therefore to your chamber, and respond on your bed of down. When you see fit, prepare a bath. Supper awaits you in adjoining the alcove, when it pleases to take your seat there." Psyche gave ear to the admonitions of her vocal attendants, and after response and the refreshment of the bath, seated herself in the alcove, where a table immediately presented itself. Without any visible aid from waiters or servants, and covered with the greatest delicacies of food and the most nutritious wines, her ears too were feasted with the music from invisible performers, of whom one sang, another played on the lute, and all closed in the wonderful harmony of all full chorus. She had not yet seen her destined husband. He came only in the hours of darkness, and fled before the dawn of morning. But his ascents were full of love, and inspired like a passion in her. She often begged him to stay, and let her behold him, but he would not consent. On the contrary, he charged her to make no attempts to see him, for it was his pleasure, for the beasts of reasons, to keep concealed. "Why should you wish to behold me?" he said. "Have you any doubt of my love? Have you any wish ungratified? If you saw me, perhaps you would fear me, perhaps adore me, but all I ask of you is to love me. I would rather you love me as an equal and adore me as a god." This reasoning somewhat acquainted Psyche for a time, and while the novelty lasted, she felt quite happy. But at length, the thought of her parents, left in ignorance of her fate, and of her sisters, proceeded from sharing with her delights of her situation, preyed on her mind and made her begin to feel her palace as but a splendid prison. When her husband came one night, she told him her distress, and at last drew from him an unwilling consent that her sisters should be brought to see her. So calling Zephyr, she acquainted with him her husband's command, and he, promptly obedient, soon brought them across the mountain down to their sister's valley. They embraced her, and she returned their caresses. "Come," said Psyche, "enter with me my house, and refresh yourselves with whatever your sister has to offer." Then, taking their hands, she led them into her golden palace, and committed them to the care of her numerous train of attendant voices, to refresh them in the baths and at her table, and to show them all her treasures. The view of these celestial delights caused envy to enter their bosoms, and at seeing their young sister possessed of such state and splendor, so much exceeding their own, they asked her numberless questions, among others, what sort of person her husband was. Psyche replied that he was a beautiful youth, who genuinely spent the daytime in hunting upon the mountains. The sisters, not satisfied with this reply, soon made her confess that she had never seen him. Then they proceeded to fill her bosom with dark suspicions. "Call to mind," they said, "the Pathian oracle that declared you destined to marry a direful and tremendous monster. The inhabitants of this valley say that your husband is a terrible and monstrous serpent who nourishes you for a while with dainties that he may by and by devour you. Take our advice, provide yourself with a lamp and a sharp knife. Put them in concealment that your husband may not discover them. When he is sound asleep, slip out of the bed and bring forth your lamp. And see for yourself whether what they say is true or not. If it is, hesitate not to cut off the monster's head, and thereby recover your liberty. Psyche resisted these persuasions as well as she could, but they did not fail to have their effect on her mind. And when her sisters were gone, their words and her own curiosity were too strong for her to resist. So she prepared her lamp and a sharp knife, and hid them out of sight of her husband. And when he had fallen into his first sleep, she silently rose, and uncovering her lamp, beheld not a hideous monster, but the most beautiful and charming of the gods, with his golden ringlets wandering over his snowy neck and crimson cheek, with two dewy wings on his shoulders, whiter than snow, and with shining feathers like the tender blossoms of spring. As she leaned the lamp over to have a better view of his face, a drop of burning oil fell on the shoulder of the god. Startled, he opened his eyes and fixed them upon her. Then, without saying a word, he spread his white wings and flew out of the window. Psyche, in vain, endeavoring to follow him, fell from the window to the ground. Cupid, beholding her, as she lay in the dust, stopped his flight for an instant and said, "O foolish Psyche, is it thus you repay my love? After I disobeyed my mother's commands and made you my wife, will you think me a monster and cut off my head? But go, return to your sisters, whose advice you seem to think preferable to mine. I inflict no other punishment on you than to leave you forever. Love cannot dwell with suspicion." So saying, he fled away, leaving poor Psyche prostrate on the ground, filling the palace with mournful lamentations. When she had recovered some degree of composure, she looked around her, but the palace and gardens had vanished, and she found herself in an open field not far from the city where her sisters dwelt. She repaired thereafter and told them the whole story of her misfortunes, at which, pretending to grieve, those spiteful creatures inwardly rejoiced. "For now," said they, "he will perhaps choose one of us." With this idea, without saying a word of her intentions, each of them rose early the next morning and ascended the mountain, and having reached the top, called upon Zephyr to receive her and bear her to his lord. Then leaping up, and not being sustained by Zephyr, fell down the precipice and was dashed to pieces. Psyche, meanwhile, wandered day and night, without food or response, in search of her husband. Casting her eyes on a lofty mountain, having on its brow a magnificent temple, she sighed and said to herself, "Perhaps my love, my lord, inhabits there," and directed her steps thither. She had no sooner entered than she saw heaps of corn, some in loose ears and some in sheaves, with mingled ears of barley. Scattered about lay sickles and rakes, and all the instruments of harvest, without order, as if thrown carelessly out of the wary reaper's hands in the sultry hours of the day. This unseemly confusion of the Pisces Psyches put an end to by separating and sorting everything into its proper place and kind. Believing that she ought not to neglect none of the gods, by devour her own pity and engage them all in her behalf. The holy Caress, whose temple it was, finding her so righteously employed, thus spoke to her, "O Psyche, truly worthy of our pity, though I cannot shield you from the frowns of Venus, yet I can teach you how best to ally her displease. Go then, and voluntarily surrender yourself to your lady and sovereign, and try by modesty and submission to win her forgiveness, and perhaps her favor will restore you the husband you have lost." Psyche obeyed the commands of Circe and took her way to the temple of Venus, endeavoring to fortify her mind and ruminating on what she should say and how best to propitiate the angry gods, feeling that the issue was doubtful and perhaps fatal. Venus, receiving her with angry countenance, "Most undutiful and faithless servants," she said, "do you at last remember that you really have a mistress? Or have you rather come to see your sick husband, yet laid up on the ground on the wound given him by his loving wife? You are so ill-favored and disagreeable that the only way you can merit your lover must be by dint of industry or diligence. I will make you a trial of your housewifery." Then she ordered Psyche to be led to the storehouse of her temple, where was laid up a great quantity of wheat, barley, millet, vetches, beans, and lentils, prepared for food and her pigeons, and said, "Take and separate all these grains, putting all the same kind and parcel by themselves, and see that you get it done before the evening." Then Venus departed and left her to task. But Psyche, in a perfect concentration at the enormous work, sat stupid and silent, without moving a finger to the inexorable heat. While she sat despairing, Cupid stirred up a little ant, a native of the fields, to take compassion on her. The leader of the ant-hill, followed by the whole host of six-legged subjects, approached the heap, and with the utmost diligence, taking grain by grain, they separated the pile, sorting each kind to its parcel. And when it was all done, they vanished out of sight in a moment. Venus, at the approach of twilight, returned from the banquet of gods, breathing orders and crowned with roses. Seeing the task done, she exclaimed, "This is no work of yours, wicked one, but his, whom to your own hand and misfortune have enticed." So saying, she threw her a piece of black bread for her supper and went away. Next morning, Venus ordered Psyche to be called, and said to her, "Behold yonder grove which stretches along the margin of the water. There you will find sheep feeding without a shepherd, with golden shining fleeces on their backs. Go fetch me a sample of that precious wool gathered from every one of their fleeces." Psyche obediently went to the riverside, prepared to do her best to execute the command. But the river god inspired the reeds with harmonious murmurs, which seemed to say, "O maiden, severely tried, tempt not the dangerous flood, nor venture among the formidable rams on the other side. For as long as they are under the influence of the rising sun, they burn with a cruel rage to destroy mortals with their sharp horns or rude teeth. But when the noontime sun has driven the cattle to the shade, the serene spirit of the flood has lulled them to rest, you may then cross in safety, and you will find the woolly gold stickering to the bushes, to the trunks of the trees." Thus the compassionate river god gave Psyche instructions how to accomplish her task, and by observing his directions she soon returned to Venus with her arms full of golden fleece. But she received not the apprehension of her implausible mistress, who said, "I know very well it is by none of your own doings that you have succeeded in this task, and I am not satisfied yet that you have any capacity to make yourself useful. But I have another task for you. Here, take this box, and go your way to the infernal shades, and give this box to Persephone, and say, 'My mistress Venus desires you to send her a little of your beauty, for in tending her sick son she has lost some of her own. Be not too long on your errand, for I must paint myself with it appear at a circle of the gods and goddesses this evening.'" Psyche was now satisfied that her own destruction was at hand, being obliged to go with her own feet directly down to Rebus. Wherefore, to make no delay of what was not to be avoided, she goes to the top of a high tower, to precipitate herself headlong, thus to descend the shortest way to the shades below. But a voice from the tower said to her, "Why, poor unlucky girl, do you design to put an end to your days in such a dreadful manner? And what cowardice makes you sink under this last danger, who have been so miraculously supported in all of your former?" Then the voice told her how by a certain cave she might reach the realms of Pluto, and how to avoid all the dangers of the road, to pass by Cerberus, the three-headed dog, and prevail on Charon, the ferryman, to take her across the Black River and bring her back again. But the voice added, "When Persephone has given you the box filled with her beauty, of all things, this chiefly to be observed by that of you, that you never once open or look into the box, nor allow your curiosity to pry into the treasure of the beauty of the goddess." Psyche, encouraged by this advice, obeyed it in all things, and taking heed to her ways, traveled safely to the kingdom of Pluto. She was admitted to the palace of Persephone without accepting the delicate seat or delicious banquet that was offered her, but consented with the coarse bread for her food. She delivered her message from Venus. Persistently, the box was returned to her, shut and filled with a precious commodity. Then she returned the way she came, and glad was she came out of more into the light of day. But having got so far successfully through her dangerous task, the longing desire succeeded her to examine the contents of the box. "What," she said, "shall I, the carrier of this divine beauty, not take the least bit to put on my cheeks to appear to the more advantage in the eyes of my beloved husband?" So she cheerfully opened the box, but found nothing there of any beauty at all, but an infernal and truly stagnant sleep, which being thus set free from its prison and took possession of her, and she fell down in the midst of the road, a sleepy corpse without the sense of motion. But Cupid, being now recovered from his wound, and not able longer to bear the absence of his beloved Psyche, slipping through the smallest crack of the window in his chamber, which happened to be left open, flew to the spot where Psyche lay, and gathering up sleep from her body, closed it again in the box. And walked Psyche with a light touch of his own arrows. "Again," she said, "have you almost perished by the same curiosity, but now perform exactly the task imposed on you by my mother, and I will take care of the rest." Then Cupid, as swift as lightning, penetrating the heights of heaven, presented himself before Jupiter with his supplication. Jupiter lent a favoring ear, and pleaded the cause of the lovers so earnestly with Venus that he won her consent. On this he sent Mercury to bring Psyche up to the heaven assembly, and when she arrived, handing her a cup of ambrosia, he said, "Drink this, Psyche, and be immortal, nor shall Cupid ever break away from the knot in which he is tied, but these nuptials should be perpetual." Thus Psyche became at last united to Cupid, and in due time they had their daughter born to them, whose name was Pleasure.